Hello, and welcome to the July 18th, 2018 edition of Shrewsbury Matters, a monthly show that presents a different perspective on the town's politics and problems. My name is John Lukács. The main topics for today's show are, first, the generally poor quality of local news reporting, especially in the Community Advocate. Second, the Shrewsbury Finance Committee and the problems with it. And third, the problems with data collection and reporting in the town's water system. And no, this will not be another segment on water rates. So first, let's talk about the poor local news reporting on town issues. The declining quality of news reporting generally is well known, but it is also evident at the local level here in Shrewsbury. Case in point, the Community Advocate. Its articles about Shrewsbury inevitably parrot whatever positions local politicians favor. They repeat whatever the selectmen say, and they only speak favorably about them. They never print opposing views. Essentially, the Community Advocate is just a mouthpiece for local politicians and the ruling clique in town. Some recent examples, and this is just within the last two editions. The July 6th edition, on page 1 was the headline, Selectmen Discuss Host Agreement for Town's First Marijuana Dispensary. I kind of question that because my understanding was it was supposed to be about retail marijuana, not medical marijuana, but that's par for the course. This is the latest installment of the Community Advocate's favorable reporting over the last 6 months on the Selectmen's decisions regarding this issue. Despite significant public opposition to retail marijuana operations, the Community Advocate limited its reporting to what the Selectmen favored or opposed. It ignored the many people who asked if it was really necessary to include a zoning component in the marijuana article that was voted at the April special town meeting. Because that article did include a zoning component, the article to ban retail marijuana operations in Shrewsbury required a 2/3 vote. So while the article to ban these operations received a majority vote, it failed to receive the necessary 2/3 vote. Thus, by default, the town allowed retail marijuana operations. Given the statewide confusion about how to implement and regulate retail marijuana operations from town to town, and the fact that the Cannabis Control Commission has not even developed all of its rules and regulations, this was a question that should have been addressed. The Selectmen could have presented two versions of the article to ban retail marijuana at the April meeting, one with and one without the zoning component. If the article to ban without the zoning component had passed by majority vote, then it would have been up to the Cannabis Control Commission and/or the Attorney General to decide its legality. Meanwhile, the moratorium on retail marijuana operations would have continued until the end of the year. Did the Community Advocate report any of this? Of course not. That would have been criticizing the Selectmen, and the Community Advocate never says anything negative about Shrewsbury's Selectmen and their decisions. A second example, also in the July 6th edition of the Community Advocate, was an article on page 11. Mizikar reflects on first year as Shrewsbury's town manager. This was another typical public relations piece by the Community Advocate, essentially implying that all is wonderful in Shrewsbury. One wonders whether the article wasn't written by the town manager himself and just mailed into the newspaper. And of course, this is nonsense. Everything is not wonderful in Shrewsbury. And I have pointed out several serious problems with their decisions on this show and in other public forums. But you will never see the Community Advocate report anything the least bit critical of the Shrewsbury Selectmen or the town manager. For example, this article spoke approvingly of the town's recent decision to zone the Route 20 corridor for mixed use in order to encourage economic growth in that area. And I'll quote from that article. It says, regarding infrastructure, the biggest challenge for Shrewsbury is the sewer system along Route 20. We have to do it right. That's where our future growth is. If we want to continue to have growth beyond the incremental growth provided by 2.5 through commercial development, and that's a critical corridor, he said. Well, but mixed use, that area was zoned for mixed use. And mixed use means that a developer will be able to build residential units on land that was formerly restricted exclusively to commercial development. and the zoning regulations do not place a limit on what percentage of the land can be residential. What this means is that many of these mixed-use developments will almost certainly cost the town more in services than it will realize in additional tax revenues. This will result in the town's budget problems getting worse over time, not better. Did the community advocate ever at least discuss that possibility? Nope. A third example was in the July 13th edition of the Community Advocate on page 9. Shrewsbury's Finance Committee bids farewell to 3 long-term members. This was another public relations piece that ignored the serious problems with the Finance Committee. One starts to wonder if the town compensates the Community Advocate for all these favorable articles. The voting records of the 3 retiring members was almost identical. They invariably voted in favor of budgets and other proposals of the town manager, the selectmen, and the school superintendent, usually without any substantive discussion. They acted like most of the other members of the Finance Committee, a rubber stamp for town and school officials. As for the 3 new members of the Finance Committee, it should be clear that at least 2 of them will also rubber stamp the decisions of town and school officials because of their prior involvement with and support for them. One of them is a former school committee committee member, and the other one is an ardent supporter of the selectmen in town. So how likely are they to be independent and open-minded? So despite town moderator's Chris Mayna's comment in the article that he seeks candidates who will have an open mind, the opposite will probably be true. But this brings me to the second topic of today's show, and that is the Shrewsbury Finance Committee. Its failure to properly perform its function as town meeting's independent financial advisors, as outlined in state law and the town's bylaws, is a real problem. Instead, it has been co-opted by the selectmen. Its members are selected primarily on the basis of how well they will get along with town officials, essentially meaning, will they agree with the selectmen's decisions in advance? Open-mindedness is not an important criteria in the selection process, if it is even a criteria at all. So let's talk about that selection process. I'm sure that the vast majority of town residents didn't even realize that 3 Finance Committee members were retiring and that the town moderator was seeking new candidates. Even town meeting members weren't informed until the annual town meeting on May 21st, and these new candidates were going to be installed effective July 1st. So other than that, there was no public notice of the 3 open positions. How fair and open can the selection process be if only people with close connections to town officials are notified and encouraged to submit their names? Not fair and open at all. The result is that current Finance Committee members do not represent a cross-section of all residents in town. All their different views on town finances and politics. Its members are tied in with the town's ruling clique. I have discussed this problem with the town moderator in the past, but he has refused to make substantive changes to the selection process that would make it public and that would open it up to all Shrewsbury residents. Because of this, the Finance Committee is no longer an effective part of Shrewsbury's town government, and this will only create more problems for the town in the future. The Finance Committee, up until about 20 years ago, was a truly independent body. There was discussion, there was debate. Compared to today, when you have nothing, you have people asking meaningless questions about side issues, very little discussion about the basic budget, very little criticism, implied or otherwise, about anything relating to the school department. They're not doing their jobs, and yet we continue to get the same kind of people filling those positions. Is it any wonder the town has financial problems? So anyway, let's move on to the third topic for today's show, and the longest one, and that is the problems with data collection and reporting in the town's water system. At a meeting in March with the town manager, his assistant, and the head of the water department to discuss problems in the water department, I offered to review consumption data in the town's water system, data in its database, for potential errors or large unexplained variances in consumption. If town manager's office would provide me with a file extract of all quarterly records for 2017, I would be able to do that and get back to them with my analysis. They agreed. In May, I finally received a file with 21 spreadsheets that was generated by some reporting software. The format was not in a form that allowed for much of the testing that I had planned to perform. But I did review the spreadsheets for certain issues, and I found several. First, records were missing. When I added the number of accounts on each spreadsheet and compared them to the summary number that was at the top of each spreadsheet, there were fewer accounts than the total accounts reported on the summary line. When I emailed this and other facts indicating that the files sent to me were incomplete and inaccurate, I received an email with the following explanations. So let me go to that first email. This is from the assistant to the town manager. What he said is that the data provided in the utility billing consumption report, which was the primary report that he sent me, was gathered via the use of UBCIS reporting tool. The use of this reporting tool comes as a new feature in the migration of UBCIS from UB Classic in June of 2017. While the reporting tool does provide an overview of a lot of data, there are some idiosyncrasies we are working through. In other words, they don't really know how to use that report accurately. They're not sure whether when they specify the criteria for what's in the report and what's not in the report, they don't know whether they're actually getting what they expected. That's a real problem. He goes on to say, as you found, there are some accounts that sequence in the numbering of a 1 and a 2. Okay, so in other words, what happens is some of these accounts actually have 2 meters associated them. So when they're provided with a suffix of -1 or -2, and that also creates a problem in terms of the record counts of how many accounts are being looked at, how many there are. So there's another area for possible inaccuracy. And then he goes on to say there are also multiple meters are located on the same property. It appears in the migration to UBCIS, the number of connections reported at the top of each sheet might be catching most of the compound meters, sewer connections, backflow connections, etc. The question is, what are sewer connections doing in a water system a database? It really, on these cross connections, and are there payments? This consumption report also shows what was paid, what kind of billings were sent out to these customers for the water they consume. Do these people get charged for those kinds of things? Don't know, because the records weren't included. Anyway, so he goes on to say that there's this, that, and the other thing, and he basically tells me some of the data that's in the database, which I already knew. But I also had asked the question of how do they know that the total consumption reported on this database agrees to the numbers that get reported to the state in the annual statistical report of water consumption by the town. His comment back was, quote, in following up with Bob Tzeski on the ASR consumption totals for 2016-2017, we believe the UBCIS reported consumption totals would agree after adjusting for due date cutoffs. What do you mean believe? Isn't that your source data? How can you just simply say, oh, well, we believe the numbers right? Again, there should be a reconciliation before you send the information to the state about total annual consumption. You ought to have a report that says, here's the information, and if you have to make any adjustments between those totals and what goes to the state, you should be able to explain those and have an explanation and have a reconciliation, a formal one. believing that your numbers are right and taking it on blind faith. I mean, that's ridiculous. Anyway, so then last week, I sent another email pointing out problems with the individual customer accounts. And this was very interesting. Let's find it here. Oops. Oh, one of the other things I should point out is that, as I said, is before I get to that second email I sent, is that when he responded to me and he said, and then I responded back and I basically said that, again, they're using a relatively new reporting tool to generate the data and admit you are working through some idiosyncrasies. To me, idiosyncrasies means you're not sure what the reports are giving you. And he also mentioned, again, that the number of connections reported at the top of each sheet might be catching some of those other types of equipment, I guess. But they don't know. And if you don't know, you can't know that the reports captured all the meters or whether they captured other things. And my particular concern is that there might be meters without any consumption, but should be getting charged a base charge, but because there's zero consumption, they're not even appearing on the report. There's all kinds of things that this report may not have picked up, and yet they're not there, and we can't find out what's there because he didn't provide a complete report of every, record in that database. And as I said, that UBCIS report, unless you tie that into the state report, the totals that get reported to the state, how reliable can the state's numbers be? Not very. So anyway, I didn't get a response to that, but I did follow up. I had said I would do some additional analysis, and while I couldn't do the kind of detailed across-the-board analysis that I wanted to do, I started scanning records, looking for very high numbers or high variability between quarters. And I found some additional things, and I don't know how much time I'll have to get into all of them, but one of them was the account for Wheelabrator Shrewsbury. And actually, Wheelabrator has 3 accounts on this one spreadsheet. The third one was very interesting. And what I'll tell you is that the heading descriptor for this sheet, where this data was, said it was for commercial. Okay, but this account says that the account is actually a well account. Don't know what that means. The more important thing is that, 2 things actually, is that these accounts had consumption, actually going back from 2014 through 2017, all 4 years, consumption ranged from a low of 1.2 million all the way up to 6.576 million. That's quite a range. And you have to ask yourself, what is all this water for? Now, I assume this is for the facility down in, the landfill down at the south part of town, but I don't know why they would need that much water. But what's really the critical factor here is none of that consumption shows any billings. All are 0. So there's 2 questions here. Many questions here. If this is a town-owned meter, even if it's a well, why aren't we getting paid at least for the meter, for the base charge, and probably getting paid for the rest of this if this is coming from the town? If it's actually a private well of Wheelabrator, well, that's news to me. Why isn't that something that we're made aware of, that they're pumping that much water out of the ground? Does that count towards the town's limit that the state imposes? I don't know. But what really is another real important factor is, if this is part of what the town reports to the state, or does it get reported to the state? Because there's no dollars shown, because there's no billings. Are all this consumption ignored when we go to calculate consumption by residents and commercial enterprises in town? If it's not, then it's part of the unaccounted water problem. Now you may say, well, you know, it's a small amount compared to the total. Yeah, unaccounted water up until last year was around over 360 million gallons per year. Well, here, this is 16 million gallons. That's almost 5% of the total unaccounted water in town. So here we have a problem right here. Nobody's ever looked at this. Nobody's ever even asked a question. I don't even know that, you know, it's amazing, you know, that they don't, and again, the variability. Why would the amounts vary so much? It's not a summertime, you know, watering thing either. I mean, you have the highest consumption is for the quarter ending in March. That's not the summertime. You know, January, February, March, that's winter. Okay, so it's not like they're watering or any other reason. So what explains all these? There's a lot of interesting questions and no answers yet on any of that kind of thing. It's amazing, and I found some other things as well, but this one here really caught my eye. This was by far, I thought, you know, some commercial enterprises, like some of the commercial companies in town, might have the highest consumption, and then come to find out that no, it's Wheelabrator, and they're not being billed, evidently, according to this report. Again, can't be sure the report's giving me accurate information, but to the extent I hope that it's giving me correct information on the accounts it's reporting, it looks like there are several problems with the way it's being billed or not billed, and whether or not these amounts are included in the commercial account, okay, that might further lower the town's unaccounted water, or might in fact reduce its average residential consumption. Those are important statistics to have when we're dealing with the state on our water permit. How can we, you know, how can we let this kind of thing happen? So anyway, I do want to go back and mention one other thing. This isn't the first time that I have pointed out serious errors in the town's water reporting. At a February 2016 Finance Committee meeting, the town manager had reported that the town's residential gallons per capita per day, it's an important statistic for the state, that number had increased to 62 gallons. He was using this increase as part of his continuing justification to increase residential rates faster than commercial rates. I emailed the town manager on February 29th of that year that his number was wrong and that the correct number was only 54 gallons, well below the state guideline of 65 gallons. I asked him to confirm and to correct the record at a public meeting. When he did not, I let the selectmen know of the error and asked them to respond. Finally, on April 7th, 6 weeks later, I received a letter from the town manager that contained the following. And let me read segments of the letter. On the annual statistical reports, I have reviewed the ASRs for the period of 2011 to 2015 in order to make comparisons to volumes I identified in previous rate studies. Understanding the different time periods and methodologies, I find that your analysis is substantially correct, that several volumes reported on the ASRs were overstated or understated to the extent that they will need to be corrected, since these variances did impact the unaccounted for water and residential gallons per capita per day. What he says overstated or understated. He's acknowledging, although he doesn't come right out and say it directly, that residential consumption was substantially overstated, as I had expressed in my email to him, and that unaccounted water, therefore, was underreported. Okay? And he goes on to say that. The good news is that the town's residential consumption should end up in the 53 to 56 gallon range, well below the 65 gallon limit, but that the bad news is that the unaccounted water is going to be even higher than what they've been reporting, which was already very bad, one of the worst in the state. One other thing. He said, in my review of the ASRs, I noted that Mr. Tedeschi is not getting the support he needs in the preparation of these reports, which he does entirely by himself and by hand. Over the past days, the IT department has written a report generator for him that is now being tested that will allow accurate metered volumes to be identified in a timely fashion. So that was something that was supposed to be done over 2 years ago. Okay? And guess what? They still have reporting problems. They're still trying to figure out how to use a reporting tool on the system that they have. And the reports that they gave me appear to have a whole bunch of anomalies and what appear to me to be errors. So how can that happen? So again, over 2 years ago, the town manager acknowledged that there were problems with reporting on the water system. And earlier this year, the water department went through an extensive review of all its metering and billing systems. But there are still serious problems. Again, how can that happen? This is just the latest example of the selectmen's poor management of the town's water system. Unresolved serious problems like dirty water, unaccounted water, and unfair water rates have long been known. And now I'm presenting to you another problem with the water system. So when are town residents going to tell the selectmen that their poor management of the water system has got to stop? Or better yet, why don't residents start sending letters to the editor of the local newspapers on this subject, assuming that is, that they will agree to print them? Something has to be done. People have got to stop assuming that the selectmen, are infallible. There's so many examples of how the mistakes they've made. As I've pointed out on previous programs, I mean, the most recent one I was talking about was the decision to build the new Beale School replacement at the Glavin Center. What that's should tell people is that the selectmen made a tremendous mistake back in 2002 when they decided to buy the Allen property. They bought the Allen property for 60 million gallons, for $66 million, excuse me, for 60 plus acres. And only now, within the past year, while they were looking at it, Allen, as a potential site for the school, did they realize that only about 14 acres of it was developable because of water concerns. So how are they going to sell that property for more than $6 million once a developer finds out that so little of the land is developable? Again, but is there any acknowledgement that, yeah, we made a mistake? No, not at all. And I could point out several other topics of this. Again, going back to the Route 20 and the mixed-use development zoning down there. That's another mistake that they made. And that mistake, people won't realize it until 5 or 6 years down the road. And then it'll be too late. So anyway, people need to wake up and be aware, and they need to contact the selectmen and tell them to get their act together. So that's about all the time I have today. Thanks for watching, and have a good day.